The Dallas Cowboys have officially trimmed their roster down to 53 players. What was the most surprising move that they made on Tuesday? All that and more this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Locked on Cowboys. Locked on Cowboys.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That is linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. I am Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can check him out on Twitter at McCoolBCB. Landon and the Cowboys have officially trimmed their roster down to 53 players. What was the most surprising move that you saw today?
I mean, again, we have to just say it. I think the whole Jordan Lewis pup situation to me still kind of scratches my head. I think, clearly they had this in mind, and clearly I feel like they had the Joseph trade in the back of their minds a little bit too. And this
Which we'll
kind of all, we'll get into all that. But to me, still, I just feel like I understand all the arguments. I understand that, and listen, I want Jordan Lewis on the team. I understand all of that. I understand having depth. I understand having a veteran guy like that. I still just don't understand why you wouldn't leverage a roster mechanism in order to keep, one extra guy if you wanted him. And that basically doesn't really cost you anything if with the hope that Jordan Lewis doesn't have to play. And so I think for them, they would rather have the safety of having Jordan Lewis potentially ready to play by week 2 or 3. If he's ready to play by week 2 or 3.
Yeah, so just to be clear, the Cowboys activated Jordan Lewis off the PUP list. They had the opportunity to keep him there. He would have missed the first 4 games of the season. There's been some different reports on how ready Jordan Lewis is.
And I think that's part of the reason that I'm so worried about this, right?
Well, because there's some reports that he's going to be ready to practice. I saw Todd Archer had a quote with Jordan Lewis. I believe it was from yesterday that said, Jordan Lewis would like another full week of practice to get ready because he feels like he's close, but he's not quite there. Mike McCarthy had his press conference on Tuesday. They asked him if he was going to practice this week, and he said, well, we're not putting a timetable on that kind of stuff. So it just feels like everything is so murky a little bit. I just wonder, we saw this play out with Michael Gallup last year, but it felt like the Cowboys rushed it a little bit. Gallup didn't play in week 1. They had the option to keep him on PUP. They decided not to, and we kind of saw that played out. This seems like it's a more serious injury because of the Liz Frank, because of how bad the foot was injured. I just wonder why they didn't take this, roster mechanism to their advantage.
I will add that, if Isaiah, and this, it has a high likelihood of happening, right? If Isaiah Land and, McEwen, we'll talk about all these guys that did end up getting cut. If they end up making it to the practice squad with no problem, then maybe this was all a worry for nothing, right? And Jordan Lewis doesn't have to necessarily play week 1. Maybe it's fine. But if one of those guys that you really want didn't make it, I'm going to be looking at this situation where you had a veteran corner who would probably have been better served to miss some more time and get healthy. Sure. And just to be clear on his comment yesterday, he didn't say he felt like he needed a week of practice. He needed another week of rehab before he felt like he was ready to practice. Yeah. So, look, and again, all the stuff we talked about with the injury, if you have questions about it, go back and listen to our mini podcast where we talked about our concerns about a non-explosive player who's almost 30 years old, getting a Liz Frank injury and what that's going to do at the cornerback position. So, we can go check that out. But I just think the roster mechanism, they didn't use it when they had it available to them, which, I felt like was a mistake.
We're going to talk about the cornerback situation a little bit more in the next segment because the Cowboys did make a trade there. Just some other quick notes here. The Cowboys did release Will Grier. That's not a surprise. I did see Mike McCarthy say they'd love to have him back on the practice squad. I've got to believe that Will Grier is going to find, if it's not on an active roster, I got to believe he's going to find a better practice squad situation where he can get more reps in the Cowboys now that they're developing Trey Lance. But we'll see. We've got to at least talk about your guy, Hunter Lipke, right?
Yeah. I mean, I was in a meeting when I saw that had happened, and I kind of had to like contain my joy a little bit. I think we've heard whispers that they have got a plan for him. So it's and obviously that's going to involve playing fullback, I would assume, or kind of just playing some multiple positions, special teams, and all that stuff. So
can we come up with a new word? Because I don't really feel like he's going to be a fullback, and he's not really a running back, right?
I mean, like they used to call it a super back, right?
Let's call him a super back because he's going to do a little bit of everything.
Because he is doing a little bit of everything. So yeah, I do think that's kind of the role he's going to. Yeah, and I do think you're right. It's probably disingenuous to continually call him a fullback like that. I mean, he's not, like I said, he's not Moose Johnson. So no. He's definitely more of a versatile move, tight end, fullback hybrid type than a modern fullback is what I would guess we call it, right?
We should also mention the draft class. Every single one of the Cowboys draft picks, I believe, made the 53-man roster, including Jalen Brooks, right? Not Miles.
Yeah, got it. Congratulations.
Eric Scott, the Cowboys cornerback.
Awesome. Man, you listed them into succession successfully. Congratulations. That's amazing.
It takes a lot of brain power there. Junior Fajoku made it. Yeah. We had Austin Richards make it. So I always think there's a little bit of number fudging that goes on here a little bit to make sure that all your draft picks make their initial 53-man roster, because it just looks really bad if they don't. But for most of these guys, it was a pretty easy decision.
Yeah. I mean, I felt like, honestly, this wasn't too different than what I put on my 53-man roster. I mean, obviously the things we talked about are different. Some of one or two names maybe. Mm-hmm. But I think there was intense competition at those like kind of 5 or 6 bottom spots of the roster. But I would say that obviously 47 to 48 of these names, it was pretty clear who was going to be on the roster.
One more thing before we kind of move on to some of the other storylines. A guy that you and I just kind of wrote off and didn't really think was going to make the roster this year was Neville Gallimore, right? Like I think kind of going into training camp, it felt like he was very much a dead man walking on this roster, but lo and behold, he had a really good camp. He had a good preseason. He beat out Quentin Bahana for that kind of last defensive tackle spot on this roster.
Yeah, he really had a strong push at the end of practice. I mean, end of training camp, right? And Bahana, who had a pretty decent camp at the beginning part, it felt like kind of just leveled off. And honestly, I won't be shocked if Bahana is also on the practice squad and back on this team. So yeah, I mean, good for Gallimore. I think, again, this points to a pedigree situation, right? Where Gallimore is a 3rd-round pick, so if they wanted to keep both him and Bahana, it was going to make more sense to try to sneak Bahana as it was to Gallimore. It wasn't like Gallimore's had that great of a camp, but he still is a 3rd-round pick.
Now, we do have a trade to talk about today. We had a certain cornerback get traded. That part wasn't surprising, but what he got traded for was pretty shocking to me. We'll get to that next. This episode is brought to you by LinkedIn. These days, every new potential hire can feel like a high-stakes wager for your small business. You want to be 100% certain that you have access to the best qualified candidates available. That's why you have to check out LinkedIn Jobs. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the right people for your team faster and for free. It's so easy to create a free job post on LinkedIn. All you have to do is add your job and then the purple hashtag hiring frame to your LinkedIn profile to spread the word that you're hiring. Simple tools like screening questions make it easy to focus on the candidates with just the right skills and experience so you can quickly prioritize who you'd like to interview and hire. It's why small businesses rate LinkedIn Jobs #1 in delivering quality hires versus leading competitors. LinkedIn Jobs helps you find the qualified candidates that you want to talk to faster. Post your job for free at linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL. That's linkedin.com/LockedOnNFL to post your job for free. Terms and conditions apply. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Every dayers. On tomorrow's show, we're going to talk about some of all the other ramifications happening from Cowboys roster moves to practice squad once we get a little bit of information there. So make sure you tune in for that. But Landon, we have a trade to talk about. The Dallas Cowboys have sent cornerback Kelvin Joseph going into year 3 to the Miami Dolphins for Noah Igbenogany. I believe I got it right. A first-round pick from Auburn who's going into the final year of his contract. Again, not surprised to see Joseph get traded. I am surprised to see him get dealt for another cornerback.
Yeah, and basically just an outside corner version of himself, it seems like. A guy that was a very high draft pick, an even higher draft pick than Kelvin Joseph, who just didn't pan out. And listen, I've obviously watched Noah play a lot. I mean, as an Auburn fan, and I remember, scouting him, going through a whole process with him when he came out, I think in the 2020 draft, if I remember. And I was surprised when he was taken in the first round. I thought it was a reach at the time. Yeah. For Miami. I think it shocked a lot of people. In fact, most folks, right. I think that, it's a situation where, I think the Cowboys both felt, and the Miami Dolphins both felt like that they could get more out of the player than the other team had gotten. And I feel like with Noah, it's the thing that's interesting is that it's, he doesn't really meet a lot of the metrics that the Cowboys usually have, especially for height. I am interested to see exactly kind of where he folds into this whole situation. I imagine he starts out as cornerback 5 or something like that.
Wouldn't even be surprised if he's just inactive on game days, honestly.
Yeah.
Because if your top 4 corners, let's say by week 4, right? Because I'm assuming Jordan Lewis will be healthy enough then to play. We Diggs, Gilmore, Bland, and Lewis. Probably that 5th corner is going to be Eric Scott, who can help on special teams, and then CJ Goodwin once he gets back on the roster.
Yeah, I mean, I'm still trying to figure it out because to me, it's like, unless they feel like, he did play some slot snaps, but he didn't play a lot. And right now, it's like I guess they're feeling like the backup slot on this team is Jordan Lewis, and then after that, Israel McQuamu or something like that. I
feel like Mike McCarthy told you exactly why they traded Kelvin Joseph in the press conference on Tuesday, because he basically said, listen, Kelvin Joseph was buried on our depth chart as a slot. He goes to Miami where he has a better chance to play inside, and that's why Miami traded for him. And we just wanted more outside corner. So to me, it sounds like, I could be totally wrong, that Deron Bland is probably going to be your week 1.
For sure.
Starting slot corner. Jordan Lewis will potentially fight him for that job once he's fully healthy. And then in certain looks, it's going to be Israel McQuamu as your big slot, just depending on the down situation.
Yeah. And I guess that makes sense. And the only hope is that, what happens if Lewis comes back and he's not what you expect, then you might have to really start to kind of consider things. But I think you like we mentioned, you have in-house solutions with guys like McQuamu who can play inside in the slot and some of these other folks. So,
I won't be surprised like Miles Brooks. I got that one right. Who the Cowboys signed as an undrafted free agent. He'll probably go on the practice squad. He is somebody that can play in the slot. If you need to go out and get a slot corner, it's a little bit easier to find that than it is to go out and find an outside corner in this defense. And they just probably feel like between Bland, Jordan Lewis, and McComo, they've got themselves covered. They just didn't have a roster spot to keep Kelvin Joseph as a 3rd slot corner, even though I really like the way he developed in the preseason.
Yeah, and maybe even Gilmore could slide in to play inside if you needed to, and then it gives you an opportunity to play one of those young guys outside. So, it's an interesting group. The funny thing about it is that even though we kind of got that aspect of it wrong, they still have an incredibly deep cornerback room. If Jordan Lewis comes back healthy, then you're still feeling extremely good about the top 4 cornerbacks in your room.
We should also mention that Nahshon Wright made the 53-man roster initially. Now, we did get a report that he's going on the injured reserve list, which means he's going to miss, I think it's the first 4 games of the year. I think that's how they
keep changing it. Yeah, but I think it is 4 games now. Yeah.
Yeah. So he'll be eligible to come back, in early October. The Cowboys are also putting Matt Waletzko on the injured reserve list. He'll be able to come back. We were talking about him pre-show.
Yeah.
He played 30 plus snaps against the Raiders despite having a bad shoulder. He's really tough, but once the Cowboys do that, they'll be able to bring back Trent Sieg, their long snapper. CJ Goodwin will come back on the roster. And it seems like Chuma Edoga will also come back on the roster because he was released today as well.
Yeah, and just to kind of give some line of demarcation, again, if you want to have them go on the IR to return, they have to be carried on to the roster for week 1. Guys like Josh Ball, who got put on the IR before the roster cuts, that means his season is over. He doesn't have the opportunity to come back. So that's why they're holding on to Wright. And I even forgot who the other one was already.
Edoga.
Well, Edoga's getting cut, right?
Well, so
right?
You're saying it was
the return
David
IR.
Durden. David Durden went on the injured reserve list. He can't come back. Same with Overshawn. Who else am I
Ball,
missing?
who we just mentioned.
Josh
and then
Ball.
The returns are Wright, and who's the other one that I
Well,
just
let's
mentioned?
go.
Well, let's go. That's sorry, yeah. Well, let's go. Are the return. So that they have to be carried on. They'll get put on IR, and then you can either call up 2 guys from the practice squad or sign some people off the street.
Yeah. Just a couple other notes about the Cowboys 53-man roster. They did release Jabril Cox. That was somebody who we talked about at length over the last couple of days. Mike McCarthy had actually a lot of positive things to say about him in the press conference today. I've got to believe that he's somebody that they would like to get back on the practice squad just to have. But
sure.
and we talked about this yesterday, I could see him being a guy that gets claimed pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean, there was definitely a reason that I felt like, I was nervous about them trying to do this is because of the pedigree, right? That someone's going to look at this and say, hey, this is a guy who just was injured, and so and linebackers who can cover, like that's a pretty rare trait. So we'll see. I'm hopeful that he can make it through, but again, if he doesn't, it just you point to that Jordan Lewis pup situation, and you say, hey, this is a guy that maybe they could have held on to, but they kind of rolled the dice. Look, and hopefully they get through. Hopefully that he gets through, and you get him back on your practice squad, and then he'll be part of the team this year.
We also should mention that Marquise Bell. We've got some rumblings like he's actually making the full-time switch to linebacker now. It seems like. I don't even know whether we should call him a linebacker or not. He's a box player, right? So I think that's why the Cowboys felt a little bit more comfortable moving on from Jabril Cox, because you still have Leighton Vander Esch, you have Damone Clark, Devin Harper made the 53-man roster. Micah Parsons can give you snaps there if you need him to. And then you've got J-Ron Curse, who functions really as a big line or, as a smaller linebacker. And now Marquise Bell. So they kept 6 safeties, although it's really more like 4.5.
Yeah, and if Overshown's a linebacker, then we could probably count Marquise Bell as a linebacker.
I mean, they're the identical size.
So it makes sense. Look, that's obviously, like we talked about, that's a very fluid situation between those two positions, specifically the kind of more box safety and linebacker. So it wasn't a big surprise or really even a position switch for Marquise Bell to kind of just step 2 inches over to the right or left and be in the right gap and just go ahead and go and play.
All right, let's talk about all the undrafted free agents that made the Cowboys roster this year. We will get to them next. The Dallas Cowboys had 3 undrafted free agents from the 2023 class that made the 53-man roster. Your guy, Hunter Lipke, was one. We already talked about him. TJ Bass, the guard from Oregon, made the 53-man roster. And what's more interesting to me is he beat out Alec Lindstrom, Brock Hoffman, and Matt Farniak for that role. It's clear the Cowboys like him a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, I wouldn't even be shocked if he may be the guy that you call off the bench first if one of these guards gets hurt. I mean, I think he looks.
Think he's ahead of Awesome Richards as a guard.
Maybe. I think it's possible. Yeah. I mean, again, we haven't really seen him play left side yet. So I mean, but that's something he starts working on this week. So it would be interesting to see exactly who the first one off the bench is there. And I think there's pros and cons to each. But yeah, I mean, obviously he was a guy we had really high hopes. If you flash back to, everydayers that remember when we were talking about this in July, we talked about these guys being, specifically Lipke and Bass, being guys that they would, they gave a lot of money, guaranteed money to, and just felt like players that fit the bill of very specific roles that could be on the roster, right? Like, and I think Bass is a guy that was an All-American as a tackle. It's still crazy to think. Slides inside a guard where it's just, you go and watch his Oregon tape, and it was just so clear that he was a guard in the NFL.
Yeah.
And we were excited to see it, and it took him a little while. Early on, it didn't feel like you were getting the full, TJ Bass experience, I guess is the best way to put it, when he was kind of getting his feet underneath him. But the last 2 or 3 weeks, he has just been dynamite and really has just played very, very well. And kind of, I think, really helped kind of raise the level of the entire backup offensive line unit. So, yeah, he's on the team. I wouldn't even be shocked if he made it active a couple of weeks in. I think he's going to have a role in this team, and we've already obviously talked about Lipke, and then obviously the big kicker, who's also the third. Name.
Well, that one we knew was happening for a while, right? Brandon Aubrey. It's just funny how at the guard position, how many different names that have been in that conversation this year.
Yeah,
the TJ Bass ended up beating out, whether it was Terrence Steele back in March when Jerry Jones suggested it, right? And then there was Matt Farniak. Josh Ball, who we mentioned, who is on IR, which I wonder if his Cowboy career is kind of over now. That
maybe
that he'd be going into year 4 next year, and it's just clearly not worked out. Brock Hoffman, Alex Lindstrom, it's just Chuma Doga. Now he'll be back, but I still wonder if Bass is higher on the depth chart. Just a pretty incredible offseason for Bass. We mentioned Lipke, we mentioned Brandon Aubrey. I also want to mention just how many undrafted free agents are on this 53-man roster for the Cowboys. Like, if we just go through positions, you have Cooper Rush, we have Rico Dowdle, who made the 53-man roster over Malik Davis, who was released, Kavonte Turpin at wide receiver. We mentioned TJ Bass at guard. I'm thinking anybody on the defensive line. I think those are all draft picks.
Hendershot wasn't a draft pick.
Hendershot, right? That's a good one. Marquise Bell, Wanye Thomas, who made the 53-man roster after not making it last year. Like, they are just loaded with undrafted free agents on this team.
Yeah. Look, I mean, they're one of the best in the league about getting these guys, securing them. It's because they have good facilities. It's because they have a high rate of giving these guys opportunities to play on the field. And look, you can say a lot of things about the way the NFL works, the way the Cowboys work. The Cowboys have never been afraid to give people opportunities, despite where they're drafted or where they came from.
You can play one of the better
on the field. That's right. They've been one of the better teams in the league about that, and obviously the roster bears that out at this point.
All right. So what's next for the Cowboys, Landon? Obviously, they have waiver claims on Wednesday. It's going to be a little hard to claim guys just because they're at the very bottom of the waiver order. But I've got to imagine the Cowboys are going to put in at least a few claims here.
Yeah, I imagine they would. I think they only put in a couple of claims last year, if I remember correctly. So, and I think it was something like, I'm quoting Dalton Miller's, I think was just saying it off the top of his head. I think there was something like 33 total claims league-wide last year. So, sometimes we can, overinflate the kind of, feeling about people claiming these guys off the waiver wire. But we're watching for that. Obviously, there are some roster mechanism stuff that's going to need to happen tomorrow, including I think they can start putting folks on IR
tomorrow. I think they can tomorrow after 4:00, I believe.
And then that will free up those roster spots for more folks. So it'll be interesting to see how those kind of, if they are just calling up guys that were cut previously, or if they are signing guys that are on waiver wire, or are they signing street free agents? Because there's still a group of folks that are basically have been waiting for today to happen, right? And to kind of the ripple effects of what happens through cut down day. And then it's going to become time for the teams to kind of turn to, okay, what do we still have left? What do we still need to kind of fill in with street free agents and veterans on the street? So look out. Now is the time for you guys to kind of be looking at who's available on the street, not just the guys that are being cut, but who, like veterans, and see if anybody could potentially fit. But I think, honestly, with the way the Cowboys roster is constructed right now, maybe a swing interior guy.
Well, I was just about to ask you, but if Terrence Steele gets hurt, like in week 1, who's playing right tackle for you?
In week 1?
Sure. Like if he goes down for 7 plays, who's stepping in and playing right tackle for you?
I still have not gotten an injury report on Chuma Edoga. He's not being waived. He didn't get waived injured from what I
No, he got
like.
cut. He got outright cut because he's a vested veteran.
So that means that he's not hurt anymore. Like he can't. I'm pretty sure that's what it means. Because
I mean, sure. Yeah,
you have to be waived injured if you can't pass a physical, right? So I'm wondering if Chuma Edoga isn't ready at this point. So if not, I don't know. They're going to need to go get they're going to need to get a temporary guy. You know, hi Jason Peters. You want to?
I mean, listen, I kind of jokingly mentioned this guy's name on the podcast the other day, but Cam Irving got cut from Carolina today.
I mean, look, I know some people are going to hem and haw about that, but there aren't a lot of great offensive linemen in the league. Cam Irving's not terrible, or at least he hasn't been when he was with the Cowboys.
And he can play. I mean, he can play 5 different spots. He got drafted to be a center by the Browns in the first round, and he can play. I mean, I think that's what you're looking at, is grabbing somebody like that can play 3 or 4 different spots and then just adding them to the group. But I worry about the swing tackle spot, especially now that Waletzko is out for the next 4 games and Josh Ball's not an option. Like there's just not, they don't have a right side player right now.
Well, it's just the right side, right? I feel like Awesome Richards, I mean, for better or for worse, is your left side back.
Probably. Yeah.
But yeah, so it's someone that's going to need to play right tackle. I mean, can TJ Bass play right tackle?
No, I want him focusing on guard.
I don't know. It's going
to have to be
it's going to have to be some veteran that they sign off the street. That's why I think that they won't do anything probably.
Well, it's almost September, which means it's time for Jason Peters to start getting in shape.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. So he's starting to stretch and get off the couch right now and maybe lifting some weights a little bit now. Yeah. So now that the cuts have started. So
the last thing really quickly, the Cowboys can start adding players to the practice squad tomorrow, or excuse me, on Wednesday. I fully expect a lot of these players that the Cowboys released, like Isaiah Land. We'll see about Jabril Cox, Jalen Moreno-Cropper, all of those guys to be on the on the practice squad. The Cowboys are pretty good about loading that spot up with talent. And if you wonder how many of these players from the practice squad ever really develop into guys that make your 53-man roster, look no further than Juan Thomas, who was on the 53-man roster, or excuse me, on the practice squad last year. Now he's on your 53-man roster.
And we also need to identify the fact that practice squad means something differently than it did 2 years ago.
Yes.
The rules that they've made, and it didn't get a lot of ink, but the rules that they made to change how the practice squad is constructed and what they're able to do on game day has really changed the roster building game completely. So now that's why you're seeing guys that are veterans on practice squads that will likely play on Sundays.
Well, I think like Sean McEwen is a great example.
Yeah,
I won't be surprised if McEwen starts the year on the practice squad and he's the one that's active on game day and Hunter Lipke isn't yet. Right.
Yeah, I wouldn't be shocked by that at all. We talked about that as a real possibility. Is that literally you have to have some game day inactives, and if you're not quite sure of Lipke's role yet, or if you just are still feeling like McEwen is at a spot where he's more consistent, then there may be games where you want more 4 tight ends than you want 3 those extra running backs. So it may just be game plan specific, right?
And you don't want to expose Lipke to waivers and have other teams claim him. So it's better off to keep him on your 53-man roster, have him be inactive, and then pull somebody up like McEwen from your practice squad to actually play in the games. I think you'll see a lot of that. You might even see, some players that are pretty decent ending up on practice squads.
Absolutely.
That, actually contribute in week 1 when the Cowboys go to New York to take on the Giants. That is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every day. Again, every day, we'll be back tomorrow to continue to break down the roster cuts and the roster moves that the Cowboys will make all week long. Go follow the show on YouTube. We are free and available on all platforms. Go check out Landon on Twitter at McCoolBCB. I'm at Marcus_Mosher, and we'll see you guys next time.